Okay, all right, so today we do Smyrna, Church of Smyrna. We just finished Ephesus last week, and and I'm glad you're here. Now, we will not be having a class the next 2 Thursdays. We'll be back in January, first week of January, to continue on. And I appreciate y'all here because I know a number of us are gone. They told me they were going to be gone today, so which is fine. That's why we filmed it. And welcome to those of you who are watching online. Glad to have you here. So why don't we open with a word of prayer, and then we will plunge right in and get the message to Smyrna done. We'll do a brief just summary of Ephesus real quick to remind us of what because it's good to compare Ephesus to Smyrna. Each of these letters relates some way not only to the inaugural vision of John, which where Christ presents himself with these images, but also with each other. So we'll talk about that. So let's bow our heads and pray, okay? Lord, bless and be with us as we gather here to continue studying John's incredible work and how it affects our lives and affects us. Help us to come with open hearts and open minds so we can interpret and understand and apply these words to our lives. Grant us, Lord, a wonderful Christmas filled with the joy and love of our celebration of you. And thank you for being our Lord and Savior. In your name we pray. Amen. Okay, so let's remind ourselves about Ephesus. If we were going to call Ephesus any type of city, it was the administrative city. Remember, that's what we called it, the administrative city. And of course, we talked about its importance. It was like the Washington, D.C. of these cities in Asia Minor. So it was highly bureaucratic, highly structured. It had numerous extremely large temples. And all of that, the characteristic of that city, played into John's letter to the church, to the Ephesians, to the church of Ephesus. And so we saw this very kind of church that had become highly institutionalized, as you'll recall, because it was fighting those who were claiming to be apostles, false apostles, but were not. And they tested them. But in their testing, they had become extremely dogmatic and authoritative. And so Jesus says to them, my problem with you is you've lost your first love. You've done well. You've done well in testing these traveling apostles who have come in. You've done well, but you've become so defensive about it. You've become so I guess you would call it strict about it, that you've lost the original love of your fellowship. And that's what you need to restore. You need to restore that love. But he also gave them props, I guess you could say, because they did not tolerate the Nicolaitans. And we talked a little bit about the Nicolaitans last week. So it ends with the proclamation formula. And we talked about how, at least in the Ephesians letter, these formulas follow general governmental proclamations, addresses, and then declarations, and then proclamations. So they follow kind of a Roman world type of royal declaration, royal edict. And that again is to set Christ's words over and against the words of the kings and the emperors and the governors, but to set Christ's words, because Christ is, Christ is the king, spiritual king of the church. Christ is the Lord and King. So John uses that language of edict, of proclamation, and says to those who are overcome, those who remain faithful to Christ to the end, they will receive the tree of life. The tree of life. And we talked about the symbol of the tree of life in paradise. That vision of, we see the tree of life after all the judgments have been made, after, as we get to the very end of Revelation, we'll see this, and then we see the New Jerusalem come down, and then the New Jerusalem is the eternal life. It is the kingdom. And you see the tree of life, you see the river of life, you see all these things that you saw in the Garden of Eden. So this goes back and it's Genesis restored. It's creation reconciled to God as creation was always meant to be. So, so we see Genesis, elements of Genesis in Ephesus as well. So now we come to Smyrna, and I call Smyrna, since I don't have my slides, I'm just going to put everything up here on the board. I call Smyrna the Jewish city. If Ephesus is the administrative city, then Smyrna is the Jewish city. Now, why do I call it the Jewish city? Well, it's really, first of all, the Jewish population in Smyrna was larger than any other population in Asia Minor. Secondly, as you will read from this letter, it is clear that there is some issue going on with, we don't know, we're going to look into that as we go through the letter. Some issue is going on with either the Jewish population or a segment of the Jewish population that the church is dealing with. So it helps us now to understand, kind of to go and understand what is Smyrna, what do we know about the city, just like we studied Ephesus, that can help us to understand what the letter's about. So first, I'm going to read the letter, Revelations 2, 8 through 11, and then we'll look at the outline that I gave you. We'll run through the outline real quick, and then we'll talk about the characteristics of Smyrna and how does that impact the letter that John wrote to them. So Christ declares, "Unto the angel of the church in Smyrna write, these are the words of the first and the last, who was dead and came to life. I know your affliction and your poverty, even though you are rich. I know the slander on the part of those who say that they are Jews and are not, but are a synagogue of Satan. Do not fear what you are about to suffer. Beware, the devil is about to throw some of you into prison so that you may be tested. And for 10 days you will have affliction. Be faithful until death, and I will give you the crown of life. Let anyone who has an ear listen to what the Spirit is saying to the churches. Whoever conquers will not be harmed by the second death." Okay. So what I want you to do is look at your outlines that I gave you right here, and let's run through the outline and see how the letter is organized in the same way that all the other letters does, but each letter has a little bit different organization. So first you start, as you always do with the letters, with the address. Everybody with me on the outline? Everybody with me? And the address is to the angel of the church of Smyrna, the address. And then the command to write. So these are the same things that we see that in the other letters. And then that declaration, these are the words formula, okay? You'll always see that in all the letters. These are the words. And again, that's pretty much the language of the edict, the royal edict. These are the words of the emperor. These are the words of the king. These are the words of the first and the last. And so these are what we call the Christological predications. In other words, it's going back to the inaugural vision as Jesus identified himself. This time, is unlike Ephesus, Jesus declares himself to be the first and the last, and the one who died and came back to life. And as we're going to observe, this very much relates to the history of Smyrna. And we'll see why as we go through. Then we come to the narration, which begins with the I know your conduct. And then it goes through your tribulation, your poverty, though you are rich, the slander you endured. From who? From those who claim to be Jews but are not, and from those who are a synagogue of Satan. So you've got the address, the command, these are the words formula, the Christological predications, the narration, and now the disposition. Do not fear what you will suffer. Satan will throw some of you into prison, and what's the purpose? God is testing you, and then gives the length of time. You will suffer for 10 days, okay? And notice it says some of you, not all of you. Make note of that. And then secondly, under the disposition, there's admonition and promise. Admonition is, be faithful to death. Be faithful to death. And the promise is, I will give you the crown of life. And then comes the proclamation formula. We know what that is. Let anyone who has an ear listen. We'll hear that in every one of the, and of course that goes back to reminders to the I had trouble with this word lately in my head. The parables. It's parabolic. It's the parables. I don't know why I had been having a problem with that word in my head. But the parables. That's what Jesus always said, or often said at the end of each parable. Let anyone who has ears listen. In this case, listen, and Jesus did not say listen to what the Spirit says, but John said listen to what the Spirit says. Talking in the context of the post-resurrection Christ. And then finally it ends with the promise to the victor formula. The one who conquers will not be harmed by the second death. So we see the outline. The outline is very clear. It helps us to understand how it fits the outline of all the letters. And like I said, each letter has a little bit difference in the outline, but they're pretty much all the same. Okay, so let's talk about Smyrna itself. What do we know about the city? Well, the interesting thing about Smyrna is it's the only city that still exists today, that's still standing. Izmir in Asia Minor is Smyrna. It's the only city left, the only city of the seven that actually stands, which is very interesting. So Smyrna is Izmir. Anybody ever been to Izmir? I had a beautiful picture on the slide. Maybe when we get back, I'll show it to you. I got a nice picture of Izmir on the slide. But, well, that's how it is with technology, right? Okay, so what do we know about Smyrna? Well, let's run through each of the characteristics. And, of course, these characteristics also inform us about the nature of the letter itself. So we know that Smyrna is Izmir. It's the only city still left of the seven standing. And we also know that it's 35 miles north of Ephesus. So these cities are relatively close to each other. Okay? 35 miles north of Ephesus. It was, at that time, a major export city. It has a great port, still does. Has a great port. One of the best ones in Asia Minor. Major export center. So, if we know that it's a major export center, what does that tell us about the makeup of the characteristic of the city if it's a major export center? What does that tell us about?
International.
International? What else?
But we can fix that with a church.
A large working class.
Very large working population. Very good. International. Also, what about cities that do it? Go ahead.
Mercantile.
Mercantile, which means what? Money, wealth. It's a wealthy city, okay? It's a wealthy city. It's also a very sophisticated, cosmopolitan city, even more than the others, probably the most cosmopolitan city. It was the birthplace of Homer and is known for its poets. So it is a highly educated city. Has a better system of education than most of the other ones. And there are other major literary figures and artist figures that came from Smyrna, okay? It also had a huge temple to Zeus. A huge temple to Zeus. Now, interestingly enough, whereas at Ephesus, the number of temples that they had informed the letter to Ephesus, right? Smyrna doesn't have a thing much in relation to the Roman or the pagan religions. It all relates to Judaism. So again, it focuses on the issue at hand that Smyrna is dealing with, okay? So that the Christian church in Smyrna is dealing with. So you're not going to hear a lot of language about, some of the competitive temple stuff going on, okay? You're just not going to hear that kind of similar language. We know that it had a population of around, at the time Revelation was written, population of around 200,000, which made it a fairly large city at that time. That's a big city back then. So a population of about 200,000. It had the first, it was the first city in Asia so it had a very close relationship to Rome in the sense of it was the first city in Asia to build a temple to Rome. It was the first city in Asia to build a temple in Rome, okay?
Makes you wonder why almost Ephesus was the big administrative seat, but why wasn't Smyrna, with that kind of population, with that kind of mercantile exchange and the money and all that kind of stuff, you would now. And I recognize Zeus is probably more important than the god of silver.
But think of the difference between Washington, D.C. and New York City. There it is right there. Because, yeah, exactly. That's it. Washington, D.C. is the capital. Ephesus was basically the capital of Asia Minor. And then here's the importing, and they're on the coast. They're on the coast. I mean, Ephesus is too, but they've got the good port. You go where the export-import's where the good port is, right? It's where the good port is. So that's what, they were very practical. Where the good port is where you did the trade. And where the trade is where the money was. And it was a very significant city, but it was, like I said, it was more like a New York than a Washington, okay? More like a New York than a Washington. Now, this is really important now to the letter. It had a massively large Jewish population compared to the other cities in Asia Minor. A huge Jewish population that was welcome and strong, and there was always the controversies between. It's really complex. The cultural relationship between Rome and Asia Minor and Judaism is very complex because Rome tolerated Judaism. And it allowed it to be because it was a religion from antiquity. It was so old that they respected it for its age. That's really why Rome did not seek to destroy Judaism, because of its antiquity. But in places like Asia Minor, it still had very big problems with the local population in terms of things that the Jews could not do that were important to the city populations, like being a part of the temple guilds, being part of the temple religion, eating meat sacrificed to idols. So there was lots of tension, huge amounts of tension between the Jewish population, the synagogues, and the population in a place like Smyrna. But so that's important to remember as we go through this. I mean, this really informs our letter to the Christian. Now, this is an important. What's happening in Smyrna is an extremely important transitional point for Christianity, because the only way Christianity was able to survive without a lot of persecution was to be viewed as a sect of Judaism. Yep, that's how. But most scholars believe that in Smyrna, they started separating Christianity from Judaism. And it was it was supposedly done by certain Jewish leaders or officials who would bring charges against some of these Christians and then prove to them that they were not a part of the synagogue. And what would happen? The Christian church lost its protection. It lost its protection, and they said no. They're not Jewish. They're not a part of us at all. And so that resulted in persecution. So you're going to hear this now in this letter. That's what you're going to hear. That's what a lot of them say is going on. A huge Jewish population. we know at least some elements of that population was hostile to Christianity. We know that. Polycarp the bishop. Polycarp, a very significant figure in the early church fathers. Polycarp was martyred in Smyrna. So we know there was persecution. Now this was later than Revelation. However, Polycarp was the early church father who knew John. From when he was young, he had met and he knew John. So Polycarp, we don't read the early church fathers, although it would be really good to read them. We ought to do a study on the early church fathers. I've never done that before, but it's probably good. Polycarp clarifies for us who John was and talks about who John was. So John the Apostle. So it's real interesting to read what Polycarp says, but Polycarp was the bishop of Smyrna and was martyred there. So that's kind of important. The reason I put that in is because it shows you how the Christian church in Smyrna grew in importance. It also shows how much persecution there was in this particular city, how much persecution there was. Okay?
Matt?
Yeah.
I'm sorry to interrupt, but I know you've been watching.
Okay.
You have a system
Okay.
software update that's asking you to put
Okay.
an okay.
Yeah, well, finally it did that, huh? Well, what do you know? All right, let's do this then. I have to tell it okay. Where's the clicker? Here it is. I hope I missed it. Okay, that's the, yeah, okay. Oh, what happened?
Somebody punched the button.
Okay, let's just gotta push the button, huh? What happened? I don't know.
I'm sorry.
Oh, that's all right.
I never told you.
Hang on, there's another one here, that's okay.
I just knew you've been wetting it.
I don't know what's going on with that, but it just needs to come back on power. I don't know what's going on. There it goes. Okay, should come back on. There it goes. And okay. All right, thank you.
You're welcome.
All right. Now let's see what happens next.
You don't make me want to know.
Where are you? Come here. Come in. Okay, maybe. Okay, there we go. Now we're talking. So maybe now we'll get it
Hooked up
to
to your
work.
laptop too.
Maybe we'll get it to work. Because I'm assuming it's on the right channel and everything. Yeah, there we go. All right. I'm going to go on and think, put everything on and see how we can do. All right. Apple TV.
Trader Joe's in my bag.
And the code should pop up. There it is. All right. Okay.
Tell you the story about
And here it comes. There it is. All right.
Huh?
Do I want to hear it?
And so let me get back to the.
Background.
I'm going to get to the picture of. Let me turn to the side here. There we go. So which one is that? Izmir. There's Izmir. All right. There we go. All right. So there is Izmir.
Military base it is.
You can see it's a beautiful city, and you can see that port, a really wonderful port. There, now we actually can see Izmir, and that's where it is today. So it's amazing to think that this is Smyrna. This is Smyrna, as it was. It's pretty amazing that it's the city that we read about in the Revelation of John that's still standing. So anyway, I'm reading through all the things that were there before, and I actually have a few more to add anyway. The church was very well organized. We know that, and obviously because it had a bishop, the church was well organized. Christian church. And it had probably a pretty good sized congregation. There were about 5 million Jews in what we call the diaspora, which was throughout the world outside of Israel. The Jewish population outside of Israel was called the scattering or the diaspora. Okay? There were about 5 million Jews. In Asia Minor, there was about 1 million Jews. And in these 7 cities, there was probably about 1 million. And like I said, and in this particular city, a population of 200,000, they had quite a number there. But there were only, in all of Asia Minor, in all of these, where these 7 cities are, there were only 50,000 Christians. 50,000. So the numbers were very small compared to the Jewish population. So keeping that in mind, we see that the Christian church was pretty vulnerable in these communities. They weren't a very large group, comparatively. So we had Polycarp Church was well organized. Then, and also Smyrna was kind of like if Washington was if Ephesus was like the Washington, the capital city, Smyrna was like the county seat. It was like the regional governing center. So it was called, and that what happened is in AD 23. Emperor Tiberius chose Smyrna as the temple warden. The temple warden. And that was kind of a honorary designation, which meant it took care, it administered all the temples of the Senate and of the emperor. The cult of Tiberius, he had his temples. Every emperor had their temples, where they worshiped the emperor. And the Senate had their own. I didn't know this, but the Senate had their own temples. There were temples to the Senate. Yeah, they had their own. I did not realize the Senate had its own religious cult until I read this. So that caught me. I knew the emperors did. I didn't know the Senate did. That's really interesting. So, but there were the temple wardens. So all the temples to Tiberius that were established. And these temples would remain long after the emperors were, every emperor had their temple, in these cities. And then the Senate, so any of those temples of the Senate or Tiberius in the whole region would be administered by the temple warden. So that was significant as well for that city. It was another part. It was the center for science and medicine. Center for Science and Medicine. Again, the cosmopolitan nature, the educated nature. Science and medicine. Yeah, that's close enough. The educated nature of the city was very important. Also, it was known for its wine, its architecture, and its wealth. Known for its wealth. That's important. Known for its wealth. It was a very wealthy city. For its wealth. Okay? So that was important to Rome, as you can imagine, and important to Asia Minor. And in the 2nd century, it was an important Christian center by the 2nd century. Now, it was still in its formative years when we see John writing to Smyrna, but by the time, let's say that John's writing about 95 AD, but by the 2nd century, by around, let's say, about 125, 130, around there, it had become an incredibly important Christian center. And that's why Polycarp was noted as the bishop. I mean, the early church fathers were extremely important leadership figures in the church, and Polycarp was one of the most prominent ones. So anyway, any questions about that? Just kind of the nature of the city? Any questions about it? We'll get to the slanders there in a minute.
By having Polycarp as the bishop, did that not bring a lot of focus on the Christians more so than what we've read before?
Oh, yeah.
Because, he's an outspoken leader.
Yes.
Therefore, the Jewish folks are going to go, aha, you are trying to set, you're a completely different sect.
And by the time Polycarp came along, remember, John is writing years before Polycarp.
Right.
But by the time Polycarp came along, the separation between Christianity and Judaism was now clear, very clear.
Okay.
And Polycarp was martyred in Smyrna. So obviously there was a movement afoot to, there's persecution at that time going on. Now, it's kind of believed that Polycarp really didn't have to be martyred. He kind of pushed for his martyrdom. He really did. Because that means that the church had enough connections with the local government to keep him from being martyred, but he said, no, don't stop it. Don't stop it. Because I think he felt himself as a martyr would further the church, would further the strength of the church. I'd have to read more on that, but I remember reading that. So anyway, let me go back to, there we go, the message of Smyrna. Okay, so at verse 8, we see that the reference back to the inaugural vision, correct? It refers to, that these are the words of the first and the last who was dead. And the angel of the church, of course, the angel being, remember, the angel, the messenger could be the one being sent to Smyrna from John. It could be the spirit of the church. And it actually has multiple meanings. So it is the messenger, and it is the angel, the divine spirit of each church. So it does have multiple meanings there. And why would it be important to say to Smyrna that Christ, to identify himself as the first and the last who was dead and came to life? Why would that be important, do you think, in relation directly to Smyrna? What would you guess? Because that's out of all the identifications, why would it be important for Jesus to say to Smyrna, I am the first and the last, and I'm the one who died and came to life? What might that indicate about Smyrna? About the church? What were they experiencing?
They may have been a number of these other prophets coming in.
It's not the prophets. What was, if Jesus emphasizes to this congregation that he was the one who died and came back to life, what's going on in the church of Smyrna? What's happening to them?
Being persecuted.
They're being killed.
Yeah.
Or they're going to be killed. Some of them are going to be killed. Some of them are going to die. So even though some may not have died yet, this is a message to them that some were going to die. That they can, and that did happen, didn't it? I mean, certainly it did to Polycarp later, but it did happen. So it's important in a city where maybe some have already died, been executed, that Jesus identified himself as the one who died and came back to life. But interestingly enough, also, in relation to Smyrna, the symbol of the city was the phoenix. Yeah, the phoenix. And there was a reason for that. Smyrna had been destroyed twice in its history. One time it was in, I think around 600, 500 BC. And it had been rebuilt. The second time had been recent, like 125 BC. 125, let's say about a couple of hundred years before John, or sometime around there. And an earthquake had completely destroyed it. And Rome had come back and built it into, again, this powerful, entity. So here is Christ taking the image, the image in Smyrna of the phoenix, and applying it to himself. I'm the first and the last. I was died and came back to life. So raising his image above the image of the city and connecting with the persecution in Smyrna itself. So again, see how particular that message is, how it applies directly. Remember, these are the identifications from the inaugural vision. But, Jesus takes each one and applies it to the city. Seven, and applies it to the 7 churches. The first and the last. So, and so we also have, if you look at your text page, here's Jesus talking about this image of the first and the last does come from Isaiah. And we talk about how much Isaiah informs Revelation. And here's a perfect example of that. Who has performed and done this, calling the generations from the beginning? I, the Lord, am first, and will be with the last. Thus says the Lord, the King of Israel and his Redeemer, the Lord of hosts, I am the first and I am the last. Besides me, there is no God. Listen to me, O Jacob and Israel, whom I called. I am he. I am the first, and I am the last. So here is a direct gloss, a direct reference to Isaiah, as Jesus calls himself first and last. So we see a prophetic connection in Jesus calling himself the first and the last, and a contemporary connection in calling himself the one who died and came back to life. Right? Makes sense, doesn't it? So and also a Jewish connection, Jewish apocalyptic connection to Isaiah. So that's important as well. So any questions about that? Any points? Okay. So that helps us to understand that. So then in verse 9, we have the passage, the words, I know your affliction and your poverty, even though you are rich. I know the slander on the part of those who say that they are Jews and are not, but are of the synagogue of Satan. Let's talk about the poverty aspect of this. Here's a rich city. So the question becomes, why is there language here about poverty? And there's several reasons for this. So poverty means the same thing in the Greek as affliction. So affliction and poverty are both the same word. So we have a double reference here, both to lack of resources and suffering from persecution. Okay, so I know your affliction, I know your poverty, and we wonder, okay, what does the word poverty mean? Well, first of all, rich was often used symbolically. Rich was often used symbolically, and it was often tied to eschatological wealth. Let's go back. If you look on your sheet again, your scriptural sheet, look at Luke 6:20 and Luke 12:33 through 34, where Jesus says, he looked up at his disciples and said, blessed are you who are poor, for yours is the kingdom of God. Now, the word poor there has some symbolic meaning, but in Luke, it is literally lack of material goods. Now, in Matthew, it's a little more of a, who are poor in spirit. The word is used, who are poor in spirit. But here, it is literally, for yours is the kingdom of God. So poverty is lifted up as a character of following Christ, of doing the will of Christ. Then below that, you'll see when Jesus says, sell your possessions and give alms. Make purses for yourselves that do not wear out, an unfailing treasure in heaven, where no thief comes near and no moth destroys. For where your treasure is, there your heart will be also. And it is a possibility. It is a possibility that this is literally what the Christian church in Smyrna did. They sold all of their possessions. And they were literally a people living in poverty in the midst of this wealthy city. Yeah, they took it literally, which some of the early churches did. Now, it's interestingly enough, poverty is also symbolic in that culture, especially among the Stoics. The word poverty meant wisdom and virtue. Okay, so poverty was associated with wisdom and associated with virtue. The Stoics were, how they were. That one did not, it was wise not to try to become rich. It was wise not to place your emphasis upon possessions. So they didn't mean poverty in the material sense. They meant, like him saying poor in spirit, like Jesus saying poor in spirit. Wisdom and being wise and being virtuous was being poor in spirit. Okay? So it connected to one of the Greek philosophies in the time in which Smyrna exists, or the time that John is writing. So what are the possible meanings of this, you are poor, but you are rich? What are the possible meanings of it? Well, the poor, it could mean, one, that they represent the lower class of society. And it probably was the case. Many of the members of the church had probably been slaves or servants in a household and had been freed, because you could free servants. And by the way, once you were, this is interesting, once you were made a servant in a Roman household, you became a citizen of Rome because you joined your citizenship to the owner, your owner. But when they freed you, you continued to be a citizen of Rome, which is very interesting. But in these cities, you could also be citizens of these cities. They had their own citizenship. So the question is, were these Christians citizens of Smyrna? Were they citizens of Smyrna? And we don't know that. But we know that Jews in Smyrna could be considered citizens of Smyrna to the point that they took official governmental positions in Smyrna. They were in the infrastructure of, at least some, not a big, just a few, but some were in the leadership of Smyrna, which is very interesting in and of itself. So certainly they were citizens, considered citizens. But we don't know if that carried over into Christianity. We don't know if that carried over into the Christian church. So they represent the lower class of society. Two, they had had their property confiscated or stolen. Could be one or the other. The government in Smyrna, in their persecution, may have confiscated their property. And they would have done that as part of the persecution. That would have been a judgment upon them. And the purpose of it would have been for them to get in line with the local religion. So they may have been just, their stuff may have been taken. What am I trying to say there? Oh, their giving had literally reduced them to poverty. That's what we were just talking about. If they took literally Luke, that passage, they may have literally given themselves out into poverty. But that probably wasn't the case either. Here's the most likely one. Here's the most likely one, according to all the scholars. Like many of the Christians in these cities with their cultures, they found it difficult to make a living in a pagan environment. They weren't hired. They weren't hired. Their businesses weren't welcome. So they struggled to make a living. And that's probably the case here when he talks about their poverty. So it's a literal, Jesus, the Jesus here is talking about their literal poverty. They more than likely, they couldn't make a living. Hardly any of the Christians in these cities could make a living. So they struggled with making a living, so they were poor. But then he talks about, but you are rich. And the word rich, of course, here again is metaphorical. This is metaphorical. Where poverty is literal, rich is metaphorical. Okay? You are rich in the spirit. You are wealthy in the spirit. And that's literally what that would mean. So is that understood? So you've got these, I was just giving you the possibilities of what poverty can mean, but just about everyone agrees, and historically we know they found it very difficult to make a living in that culture. So that's probably what it was when he says that you were poor. So now he goes to the slander. Okay, the word slander. I know the slander on the part of those who say that they are Jews and are not, or are a synagogue of Satan. Well, let's see, slander. Let's go to that. Okay, here are the 6 slanders. If you look up here at the slide, here are the 6 slanders aimed at the early church. Cannibalism, right? Why would they be accused of cannibalism? Why? Communion.
Yeah.
They ate the body and drank the blood of Christ. Yes, yeah. Which was taken literally by the pagan cultures. And just like, cannibalism was very much frowned upon in Roman culture and in the pagan and in the Hellenistic culture of Asia Minor. Cannibalism, lust and immorality. Why lust and immorality? Why? Can you guess why they were slandered as being immoral?
Sisters and brothers. Sisters
and brothers. Y'all have learned well. You've learned well. They called each other sisters and brothers. So if you are married to your sister, That's,
You must be from the South.
you must be from the South. Hey, I'm from the South, pal.
I knew you were gonna get in trouble.
Oh yeah, you're in trouble already with that one. So there.
Why do you think I said it?
No. Exactly, I know why you said that out. So breaking up of homes and families, which was true. Why? Why did Christianity break up homes and families?
Well, if someone became a believer and the rest of the family didn't, they'd probably ostracize.
This was particularly true for the Jewish Christians who had been kicked out of their families for being Christian. So this may not have applied, it could have applied to pagan families, but it was very applicable to Jewish Christians or Christians with a Jewish background. Paul himself had been kicked out of his family. So they were accused of breaking up atheism. Why would they be accused of atheism?
They didn't worship the pagan god.
They did not worship the emperor or the pagan gods. So they did not worship the emperor. And in Rome, because they didn't worship the emperor, they were accused of being atheists. They were accused of being atheists. Now, again, these accusations, these slanders, would not exist if the Christians were associated with the Jewish synagogue, the Jewish community. But they had already been separated clearly, at least in Smyrna, from the synagogues and the Jewish community. Because they would have never accused the Jews of being atheists. But they would certainly accuse the Christians of being atheists. Political disloyalty, no need to explain that. And incitement to riot. And we go back to Paul's story, where, and this is where it gets interesting, because just like Nero, the Christians kind of became convenient scapegoats for turmoil and conflict in the city. The Christians were easy to blame. Why were the Christians easy to blame? Why? As Nero did. Why would they be easy to blame? Well, first, because of what you see before. And secondly, there weren't a lot of them. So, but there were enough of them to have the attention of the city. Secondly, they did not participate in the economic culture of each city, because the economic culture was tied up to the temples and to pagan worship. Whereas the synagogues had relaxed those rules except for eating food offered to idols, and they allowed. Furthermore, many of the Jews in Smyrna and in these other cities weren't necessarily Jewish members of the synagogue. They simply ID'd themselves coming from a Jewish family. It was an ethnic identity. So they weren't really associated with the synagogue. They just lived in the city. Don't assume that all the Jews went to the synagogues. They didn't. In a few minutes, we're going to see all the different, what this word Jews could mean when we read it in here, what it could mean. And it could mean a number of different things. In fact, here we are right at that point. If you go back to the passage, look what it says. I know the slander on the part of those who say they are Jews and are not, but are a synagogue of Satan. This is where like we find the difference between anti-Semitism in the early church and not anti-Semitism in the early church. And we can misread it because the issue is not the Jews. The issue is those who say they are Jews but are not. Now, what could that mean? What could that mean to say they are Jews but are not? Well, first of all, look at your text. Look at your Bible text at Romans 2, 28 through 29. Everybody see that? For a person is not a Jew who is one outwardly, nor is true circumcision something external and physical. Rather, a person is a Jew who is one inwardly. And real circumcision is a matter of the heart. It is spiritual and not literal. Such a person receives praise not from others, but from God. So, reading that from Paul in Romans, what could we possibly say about those who call themselves Jews? If we think in the context of what Paul is saying. those who call themselves Jews, why are they not Jews? Because John says, but are not. So if you look at Paul's writing, why would they not be Jews? Does that make sense? Am I making sense? Okay, let's look at Paul. What does Paul say in Romans 2, 28 through 9 is, who is a Jew, according to Paul?
Someone who takes it in their heart.
Good, good, good. Now let's apply that to these Jews who are not in Smyrna. What would that judgment be based upon, that they call themselves Jews but are not? Based upon what?
Whether they go to the temple or not.
That's a good start, but I think it goes beyond the synagogue.
I was going to say whether they were practicing the Jewish...
Whether they were ethical.
The tenets of Judaism.
Yes. Whether they were ethical or not. Exactly what that means. That's one meaning of it. One possible meaning. Go ahead.
Why would it be advantageous for anyone to declare themselves to be a Jew?
Well, I don't think we're talking about people who declared themselves to be Jews. I think what one perspective of this phrase is that John is saying these are Jews, but they don't act like Jews. They're not religious Jews. They're not spiritual Jews. Because if they were spiritual Jews, they would not be doing these things to the church. They would not be doing these things to us. Okay? That's it. See, they're not acting like, now this is one possible interpretation, okay? They are not acting like an ethical Jew should act, because they would never lie and turn us over to the government officials. See? So I think it's not a matter of saying some are deceptively calling themselves Jews. I think they're making a distinction between an ethnic identity and an ethical identity. Ethical identity. And in Romans 2, that's exactly what Paul does. Paul makes a distinction between the ethical, something external and physical, and the ethical. And real circumcision is a matter of the heart. It is spiritual and not literal.
Put those two in chronological order. Paul and...
Paul, let's say, was martyred around in the 60s. John was alive then, writing, but John was writing this in the 90s. The letters to the 7 churches were in the 90s. So Paul had already been martyred probably about 20 years before.
Okay.
Would be our guess. Paul first.
Okay.
Yeah, and of course they were familiar with the letters of Paul. In fact, Ephesus was started by Paul, and probably Smyrna too. Just about all these churches were established by Paul in his work in Asia Minor. So we know he started the Ephesus church. He wrote a letter to the Ephesians.
Right.
So we know he started the Ephesus church. We think there actually is a letter to the Smyrna church. It's lost. We think there may be a letter to the Smyrna church, but it's lost. Nevertheless, so you see Paul's theological distinction. He's making a theological distinction and not an ethical distinction. So this may not have anything to do with the Jews who are in the synagogue worshiping God. It may have to do with the ethnic Jews who are in the governmental system, who are making sure that the local government of Smyrna understands that Christians do not deserve the rights that the Jews do, that they are a different group. Okay, does that make sense? That makes sense. So that's one way of looking at that, okay? There are several other ways of looking at it as well. The speaker could be implying, now this again is very much the way Paul thought. The speaker could be implying that none but his own community are true Jews. That would be inclusive of the Jews of the synagogue in Smyrna. All of the religious or ethnic Jews, but that Christians are the true Israel. And Paul called Christians, believers in Christ, as the Messiah. And he was a Jew himself. called Christians the true Israel. So this could be a much broader separation. Make sense? Which is much more condemning, but it just sweepingly separates. It sweepingly separates those who are Jews from those who are Christians, and that Christians are the true community of grace. And Paul says that quite often. And he can even point back to Scripture where Jesus says, "Who are my mother, my brothers, and my sisters?" And he points to his followers and said, "These are." Let's read together John. Now, when it comes to that idea, let's read John 8:31 through 47 on our list. And it's on the back of the page as well. Then Jesus said to the Jews who had believed in him, "If you continue in my word, you are truly my disciples, and you will know the truth, and the truth will make you free." They answered him, "We are descendants of Abraham, and have never been slaves to anyone. What do you mean by saying you will be made free?" Jesus answered them, "Very truly I tell you, everyone who commits sin is a slave to sin. The slave does not have a permanent place in the household. The Son has a place there forever. So if the Son makes you free, you will be free indeed. I know that you are descendants of Abraham, yet you look for an opportunity to kill me, because there is no place in you for my word. I declare what I have seen in the Father's presence. As for you, you should do what you have heard from the Father." They answered him, "Abraham is our father." Jesus said to them, "If you were Abraham's children, you would be doing what Abraham did, but now you're trying to kill me, a man who has told you the truth that I heard from God. This is not what Abraham did. You are indeed," this is amazing, this statement, "you are indeed doing what your father does." They said to him, "We are not illegitimate children. We have one Father, God himself." Jesus said to them, "If God were your father, you would love me, for I came from God, and now I am here. I did not come on my own, but he sent me. Why do you not understand what I say? It is because you cannot accept my word. You are from your father, the devil." Ding, 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 ding. Right there. Synagogue of Satan. Right there. "And you choose to do your father's desires. He was a murderer from the beginning, and does not stand in the truth, because there's no truth in him. When he lies, he speaks according to his own nature, for he is a liar, the father of lies. But because I tell the truth, you do not believe me. Which of you convicts me of sin? If I tell the truth, why do you not believe me? Whoever is from God hears the words of God. The reason you do not hear them is that you are not from God." So, there is a clear theological connection in John the Apostle's writing to John the apocalyptic prophet writing. So again, maybe that helps us to, maybe that's another kind of, what would you say, pillar under the, a pillar in the foundation of the idea that John the Apostle was also John the Evangelist, was also John the apocalyptic writer. But there was an evolution in John's thought through the years. But we certainly see language here that relates directly to what we read in the letter to Smyrna, right? Because what is that? This is in John. And by the way, these words of Jesus are not in Matthew, Mark, or Luke. They are unique. They're not in Matthew, Mark, or Luke. They are unique to John. That's interesting. That's important. They're unique to John. We don't find them in the other Gospels. But yet we find something similar in Smyrna, in the letter to Smyrna. So that's interesting. So the synagogue of Satan literally could be what Jesus was talking about here. Okay? If you're treating the church this way, you are not the true Israel. I mean, that's basically what Jesus is saying here. Right? And so that's pretty strong language there. So it could be that. It could be that. So it's interesting. So I wanted you to see the comparison here. Remember that the Ephesian church had a problem with these self-styled apostles, right? Smyrna has a problem with self-styled Israelites. Self-styled Jewish believers. They have a problem with. So you see there's a parallel there. You see the parallel there. That's what they're struggling with. They're struggling with those who call themselves Jews but are not. However we define but are not and what that means. What that means. I like to think, just because, I like to think that it's from an ethical point of view, rather than this huge separation between Christianity as the true Israel and Jews as a synagogue of Satan. I like to think that it's a little bit softer than that. That, in other words, it's a condemnation of the righteous Jews would not do this to us. But those who ethnically identify themselves with Judaism, they're not of the true synagogue. Does that make sense? That's what I'd like to think, but I could be wrong. Let's see. So anyway, there all that is. You can see that it's very clear. The accusation of being a synagogue of Satan. By the way, Satan, the word, we automatically personalize it, but it also meant in that time adversary or slanderer. So it could be synagogue of adversary, synagogue of slanderer, okay? So it may not be as strong as we interpret it today as we think about Satan, because Satan was also an image for slandering and your adversary. Anyone who was your direct enemy is a Satan, okay? So think about that. That's a possibility as well. The slander is a verbal denunciation of Christians before the civil authority. Look at Acts 18, 12 through 17 in your list of Bible verses today. But when Galileo was proconsul of Achaia, the Jews made a united attack on Paul and brought him before the tribunal. They said, "This man is persuading people to worship God in ways that are contrary to the law." Just as Paul was about to speak, Galileo said to the Jews, "If it were a matter of crime or serious villainy, I would be justified in accepting the complaint of you Jews. But since it is a matter of question about words and names and your own law, see to it yourselves. I do not wish to be a judge of these matters." And he dismissed them from the tribunal. Then all of them seized Sosthenes, the official of the synagogue, and beat him in front of the tribunal. But Gallio paid no attention to any of these things. So, from Acts we read a common process it was to bring Christians or Christian leaders before the government officials with an accusation, right? And what Paul is saying here is that generally these government officials did not want to get involved in the eternal religious politics of Judaism or Christianity. They did not want to do that. Justin Martyr, who lived between 100 and 165 AD, so probably at his peak around 160, 165, mentioned that Jews persecuted Christians and cursed Christians actually in the synagogue, some of the synagogues. That's what Justin Martyr said. He wrote that they persecuted them, and in the synagogues they had prayers to curse Christians. Which actually would make sense, because what you've got to remember is Christianity drew a number of Jewish believers to it, especially Gentiles who were sympathetic with the synagogue and who supported the synagogue with their funds. They would leave the synagogue and come and be a part of the Christian church, because always the Christian message was very attractive to Greek, to Gentile people, because it made no demands except for baptism as the sign that you belong to the community. There was no demand for circumcision. There were no dietary laws. It allowed the Gentiles to live more like Gentiles and at the same time be accepted as the people of God. That was very attractive to the Gentiles. And so they would leave Judaism, where they were somewhat treated as outsiders, and they would be embraced in the Christian church. Does that make sense? Does that make sense? In fact, they were embraced to the point where some of the Jewish Christians quit Christianity, left it, because it became too Gentile for them. They couldn't accept it. That happened. Some of the early churches that were made up primarily of Jewish Christians disappeared. Yeah. That's really true. It's really true. And I think I think a lot of Jews entered into Christianity thinking that it was a sect of Judaism. That believing in Christ as the Messiah was a part of a part of Judaism. But Christianity caused the Jewish religion so many problems that they wanted to separate Christianity out. Right? I mean, Christianity's done the same thing. It's had people within it that they separated out because they caused the Christian church a lot of problems. That's happened before too. That's what heresy is all about.
So what do the Jews for Jesus believe now?
Well, they call themselves completed Jews. That's what they call themselves. They don't. Now, in the eyes of the Orthodox Jewish religion, they are not Jews. They've given that up. But in their eyes, they call themselves completed Jews or Messianic Jews. And they believe Jesus, they don't use language that we use like the Son of God. They use He is the Messiah, the expected Messiah, okay? They don't use all the different language that we use in Christianity. But they say He is the one, and they believe in Him as the Messiah, the one who was promised by the prophets.
And a Redeemer. Like in Isaiah.
Yeah, exactly. I have had the Chosen People Ministries, the leader, that was in North Carolina, this one was in the Southeast, and I had the leader come to our church. This is way back when I was first in ministry in Charlotte. And he was wonderful. And it was like, I'll tell you, it was amazing when he spoke. It was like listening to Paul speak. You thought you were listening. You thought Paul had come back in this person. And it all made sense when he spoke about how he was kicked out of his family, how he came to the decision that this Jesus actually was the Messiah. He said, I read the Hebrew Scriptures. He said, I didn't read New Testament. He said, I read Hebrew Scriptures. That's how I came to the conclusion that it was talking about Jesus of Nazareth. So it was really amazing. It was I wish I could. I don't know if he's still alive or not. I assume he is. I'd love to bring him here. He was just an amazing speaker. And when you understood a lot of stuff after he spoke about what it was like back then. But he would say, that he is the Redeemer, but he has come to redeem Israel. Of course, they believe in personal salvation, but it's more of a I don't know if it's political, but I would call it more nationalist. Even national is kind of shaky because we think politics, but more of what the spiritual Israel, okay? It's focused on Israel. So it's really fascinating. So that was a really good question. That was a good question. So we see the adversary, the slander. We see in Acts that probably what was happening in Smyrna was the same thing. The Christians were being brought before these civic authorities with accusations, and maybe the civic authorities were responding, but even if they didn't, it separated the Christians from the protection that Rome had been giving Judaism. Yeah, exactly. It made that separation because they would say, this is not us. So wouldn't it be natural then for Jesus to follow up with, do not fear what you are about to suffer. Be not afraid. Be not afraid is a phrase we've heard many times, haven't we, in the New Testament. Where have we heard the phrase, be not afraid? Where have we heard that?
Well, the angels.
Yes, the angels are always saying, be not afraid. Here's the angel of the church of Smyrna saying, be not afraid. Don't be afraid of what you are about to suffer. Stop being afraid. The church certainly must have lived under an atmosphere of fear. And when the devil is associated, the synagogue of Satan, for John, those who oppose the people of God are agents of Satan. Anyone who opposes the people of God, for John, is an agent of Satan. That's how strongly they viewed that. If you were opposing the Christian church or opposing the Christians, you had aligned yourself with Satan. So that's one way John looked at it.
But the fear didn't come from the government. The fear came within, from the Jews not accepting the Christians and wanting the government to act.
Yes.
The government said, no,
Well,
not our problem.
we don't know if it didn't act. Sometimes it acted, sometimes. It depended on who they brought it before, right? Because whoever they brought it before, the official, had the power to make that decision. We're going to talk about that when we conclude here, because we're just about finished, of how they made these decisions. In fact, let's go on and jump to that. Look at this page right here. This will be helpful. Page you got with the paragraph right here. And let's read that. This will be helpful. The Roman legal system had two major institutions for indicting those who violated the law. The sitting juries, which were never used in Asia Minor, and the judicial inquiry procedure. This procedure, by the way, which was used in Asia Minor, placed the examination and decision into the hands of a Jewish magistrate. Charges against defendants had to be made by a prosecutor who could either, I'm missing a word there, an injured party or a personal, who could be either an injured party or a personal enemy, or by one who was financially rewarded for this work. The accusation was submitted in written form to a magistrate willing to accept it, who placed it on an official list of those awaiting criminal trial. The magistrate had to decide whether the accused should be imprisoned, or be placed under house arrest, or be charged bail. So there were three results, okay? You could be in prison, you could be placed under house arrest, or you could be, now Paul was placed under house arrest. We saw that in several places. And when he was, a Roman guard was assigned to be with him. But you were very free to move around, and people were free to come and go. And same thing in the prisons. You could be visited in prison by anyone. They could bring you food. They could bring you, things that you needed. But prison was not a sentence. They did that sometimes later, but in the earliest times of the church, Roman government did not sentence people to prison. Either you paid a fine, or you were executed, or you were released. One or the other. One or the other. So it rarely, there was no such idea of what we have today of being imprisoned as punishment. Imprisonment was not punishment. Imprisonment was the place you waited to be judged. Punishment was generally death or a huge fine. So, or things like that. So this is the system that would have existed in Smyrna. This tribunal system, and there would have been a magistrate. They would take the charge to the whoever these who call themselves Jews but are not, whoever they are, they would have taken the charge to the magistrate. Then the magistrate had to decide what to do. And some of these magistrates might have cooperated for different political reasons. Others may have not gone along. So you never knew what the result was going to be. And that's why it makes sense. Let's go back now to where it says, do not fear what you're about to suffer. Beware, the devil, remember the agents of Satan, is about to throw some of you into prison so that you may be tested, and for 10 days you will have affliction. John promises that they will be in prison, but it's only some of you, not the whole church. So whoever is brought before these tribunals for whatever reason, they're the ones that are going to suffer. Okay? Not the whole church. This isn't going to happen to the whole church, but to some of them. If it's some of them, who do you think it would be in the church? Who would be the logical people that would be brought before the tribunals?
The leaders.
The leaders, the leadership, the elders. That would probably be the case, or the prophet, or whoever was influencing the congregation. That would probably be the case of who it was. But it could be anybody too. I mean, it could be anybody who was a part of the church. And in this case, when a Christian or a Christian group was in prison, the primary purpose was for coercion. It was to convince them to be part of the temple cult, to declare that either the local god or the emperor was a god, all those things, these smears, to denounce Christianity themselves, or at least parts of it. So it was for coercion that they put them in prison. Not generally for execution, but for coercion. Now, some were executed, and some were tortured in prison, but that was generally to get information. Torture was used to get information. So to some of them, this is going to happen. So why 10 days? Why 10 days? Well, I think I've got that answer there in your list of Bible verses. Daniel 1, 12 through 15. Please test your servants for 10 days. This is just an example of the use of the word 10 days in Hebrew. Let's be given vegetables to eat and water to drink. I'm not going to read the whole thing. At the end of 10 days, it was observed that they appeared better and fatter than all the young men who had been eating the royal ration. Actually, this is kind of funny. Please test your servants for 10 days. Let us be given vegetables to eat and water to drink. You can then compare our appearance with the appearance of the young men who eat the royal rations and deal with your servants according to what you observe. So he agreed to this proposal and tested them for 10 days. And at the end of 10 days, it was observed that they appeared better and fatter than all the young men who had been eating the royal rations. So I don't know what the context of this is. I just know that 10 days represents some period of time, but it's a shorter period of time than, say, 40 years. So, however, that's one interpretation. It is also interesting that it could be 10 days could be the time from imprisonment to decision. From imprisonment to decision. They wouldn't leave you long in there. So 10 days might have been the normal time, particularly to decide executions. They weren't going to let you linger if they decided to execute you.
So they're waiting for their sentencing.
Right.
Yeah, yes, 10 days might have been the average. For some reason, I think there's something culturally, some scholar found that said it took 10 days to adjudicate many cases. So that could be literal here. 10 days could be literal here. The 10 days while you're waiting to find out what's going to happen to you. Or it could simply mean a short period of time. And then the end of the passage where, be faithful until death and I will give you the crown of life. There's the promise. Let anyone who has an ear listen to what the Spirit says to the churches. Whoever conquers will not be harmed by the second death. All right, let's conclude real quick. The crown of life, the Stephanos, that's what it was called. The Stephanos, a Roman cultural thing that was part of the whole world at that time. A victor's wreath. And by the way, John switches now his talking from the ones he just mentioned, that small group, to the whole church. So this applies for the whole church. Not just Smyrna, but all 7 churches and anyone reading this. Be faithful until death, and I will give you the wreath, the crown of life. Smyrna was famous for its games. So we're talking about, a wreath can represent a number of things. It can represent a number of things. It can represent athletic victory. It can represent military victory. there was just like a ton of things that a wreath can represent. And so I just want to make sure I got my notes right. Yeah, okay. So it, generally what is believed here is that he's talking about a athletic contest, because Paul used that language very much. The winner, the one who runs the race will win. Will win the race and receive a wreath or an award. So I'm not going to go through all the images that I gathered, but there are tons of images in the New Testament that relate to athletic contests, and so that's what it was, and it's addressed to all. So you'll win, because it was a contest, and it was and the language of contest is very common in Revelation. The struggle, the contest between the gods and God. The struggle between the emperor and Jesus. So it is kind of that kind of language. It could mean it could mean a military, but usually that's not the case. It usually means athletic. And then the second death. Second death is a rabbinic term for the death of the wicked. So it comes from rabbinical language. And the second death, this term, remember we said there are several, there's an early revelation that's combined with a later revelation. And that the seven churches is like the end, time-wise, chronologically. The seven churches was like the last thing written by John. But earlier in John, and we're going to get to that after we get through the seven churches, the early stuff, it talks about the second death. Which, of course, it's easy to understand what the second death is. It is being judged, being, as they would say, thrown away by God. It is the judgment after death, the second death. And so, in other words, you will see a lot of the second death as we go to the later parts of Revelation. The death of the wicked. The death of those who have opposed God. So this image will appear later in chapter 21 of Revelation. We'll see it. That'll be a long time from now, but we will get there. So in chapter 21, we'll see that. Okay, so that ends Smyrna. Any questions about Smyrna today? And we're going to go next to Pergamum, which is the capital city, and capital of what? That capital of the region. Ephesus was kind of the administrative city, but Pergamum is the capital city. We'll go through that as we go into it when we all get back. And please have a safe Christmas, please, and a wonderful one. Any questions? Yes?
The reference that you gave for the Roman legal system says that it was always the hands of a Jewish magistrate.
Well, the Jewish magistrate was the prosecutor. That was the prosecution side. But it was a Roman magistrate that made the decision.
No, that's not what it says.
Well, I think that's what it means. I believe that's what it means.
Placed the examination and decision into the hands of a Jewish magistrate.
That's interesting.
And then the other reference to the system is this Galileo, who's
Gallio. Gallio is not.
And Gallio
was not a Jew.
obviously not Jewish.
God was not Jewish.
You guys have a problem with Jewish law. Figure it out yourselves.
Well, and maybe when it was turned, maybe there was a Jewish juridical system within these cities where if the Roman government said no, it was handed over to the Jewish juridical system.
Pontius Pilate.
That I could.
He worshipped.
Yeah, that's what I'm thinking. Because remember, in Jerusalem, the temple, the Sanhedrin was the city council. But in these diaspora, they may have had their own juridical system. That would make sense, wouldn't it?
Yeah.
That would make sense. So the Roman magistrate would just hand it over to them and go,
Not my job.
not my job. Which we do see that. We do see that happen a lot. We don't want to get involved in your stuff.
Internal affairs. You know.
But what the Jewish magistrate would try to make it. The Jewish magistrate probably didn't have a lot of power to punish, and maybe would have handed it back over to Rome and said, you need to. These are not. They're not Jews. They're not Jews. These Christians are not Jews. So you prosecute them because they're not Jewish. They don't belong to us.
But the indictment had to do with breaking Jewish law, right?
Correct. I assume so, yeah. But what would the punishment be? What would the punishment be? Maybe the punishment was condemnation, so that again they were separated from the protection. Maybe that might have been it. It's really tough, but I have to do a little more research on that one. See if I can get a better answer. Yeah, because that would